We are on Mem Gimel Amud Beis 43b, the very last line. So the last couple of lines, we went from Rav Dimi, who brought us information from Eretz Yisrael, us here in Bavel, in Babylonia. We're getting information from the Holy Land. So Rav Dimi brought us information from Rabbi Yochanan, speaking in the name of Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. And from there, the Gemara went on to a number of statements made by Rabbi Yitzchak in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, speaking in the name of Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. And the laws were tangentially connected one to the other. And one of these laws was this idea that within 4 cubits of a corpse, one may not recite the Shema or do any other of the other mitzvahs, because of the verse, citing the verse which says, "Lo yiglarash chodev haiseu," one who mocks the poor is he's doing a disgrace. So the poor being those who are past are bereft of any commandments, of any mitzvahs, and we perform mitzvahs in their presence. It's like laughing at them. It's making a mockery of them, right? Which is why we tuck our tzitzis when we go to a cemetery. So the earlier statement was that if you're not in the cemetery, just there's a corpse somewhere buried or wherever, and anywhere within 4 cubits, one should not recite the Shema or do any other mitzvahs. That's how much space the corpse takes up. So in that context, the Gemara now brings another statement regarding the space that a corpse occupies in halacha. So the very last line on 43b, Mem Gimel Beis. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yitzchak further stated, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Mishum Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, quoting Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, top of Mem Daled Amud Aleph 44a. Quote, mace, a corpse, Teufes Arba Amas, occupies 4 cubits, Latuma, for the law of Tuma. This is part of the rabbinic, on the list of rabbinic enactments, all the things that we brought from Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov were rabbinic ideas to prevent either the appearance of a sin or prevent someone accidentally falling into a sin or something of that nature. And here, the halacha is, as Rashi explains it, that the sages established that a corpse occupies 4 cubits, and that anyone within the 4 cubits becomes impure by rabbinic law. So to explain the necessity, 4 cubits is what is it? This is about a cubit. No. A cubit is like an amma literally is a full hand, but sorry, it's about 1.5 feet each one. That's what we're talking about. Cubits are ammas. You're thinking of tefachim. Handbreadth is a tefach, and tefachim is in plural. We're talking about amos, which is cubits.
Oh, so it's the same thing.
We're talking about amos, yeah.
Okay.
Just translating it as cubits, but it's something like 1.5 feet, roughly. So 4 cubits is quite a big space. Yeah. Now, Rashi explains the reason why the sages made this enactment is so that someone who is trying to maintain a state of ritual purity, right? We've talked about this before, that this is a big part of Jewish life. It is not part of our life today. In fact, the whole reason why we wash our hands before a meal is to remember that part of our life that doesn't exist now. It's one of the rabbinic mitzvahs to wash our hands before we eat, to remember what used to be, where before they ate, they were constantly conscious of, am I impure? Is the food impure? Do I have to do something that requires purity soon? A big part of their life, especially if you lived in Jerusalem, which meant that your life in one way or another revolves around the temple, either because you're kohen and you're serving, or because you're trading in goods that are going to be used in the temple. You're selling goats and sheep and flour for people who are making their offerings or whatever. Or even if you weren't in Jerusalem, in which case you didn't necessarily mind being impure, but at some point, at least 3 times a year, maybe more, you got to travel to Jerusalem, enter the temple, and you have to go through a process of purification. And during the time of process of purification, you have to maintain your purity. So it was a whole set of laws that people were conscious of when they were eating, touching things, and going places that we are not aware of nowadays. So if someone was in such a position where they tried to maintain, where they were working to maintain their purity, so there are all kinds of like fences that the sages put in place to help you maintain that status of purity. In the same way we have fences around our laws of kosher, half of which we may not even be aware of. We just know the laws of how we perform kosher. It's very possible, likely, that many of the things we do are rabbinic enactments to make sure we don't inadvertently end up eating not kosher, God forbid. So the same thing would apply here. And the law is like this. One of the ways in which you can contract impurity from a corpse, which would be the highest level of impurity, and that lasts the longest, the last 7 days, and the most complex process of purification, right? And again, being impure is not a problem. It's only if you want to go to the temple or do something ritually, you have to go through purification. So if you were in a state where you wanted to remain pure, so you have to avoid the corpse. And becoming impure by a corpse is rather easy, especially if considering that under most circumstances, certainly let's say a grave site, the impurity of that grave or that body goes up to the Bekas va'ola, it goes up to the heavens, and Bekas v'edison goes down as deep as it can possibly go in that airspace. It's like a vertical airspace, the size of the corpse. Now, if your hand went into that airspace, which would be in the halachic terms, you created a tent over the corpse, and you would have contracted that impurity. Or if you put your hand in the airspace that goes below it, under certain circumstances, then again, the corpse will be a tent over you, rendering you impure. So if there's a corpse somewhere near there, and you're walking by, and you say, okay, I'll be careful not to touch it, not to put my hand in the airspace, and accidentally you get shoved or this or that, now your hand's over it, and you're impurity. So the sages said, you know what? All corpses take up 4 cubits. So if you're trying to stay impure, don't even go within 4 cubits of a corpse, and that way we avoid ever becoming impure. That's the law here. So this is the law articulated by Rabbi Lezer ben Yaakov, which again, us in Babylonia did not know this law, or at least we didn't know the statement from Rabbi Lezer ben Yaakov. It was brought to us by Rabbi Yitzchak, who quoted Rabbi Yochanan, who quoted Rabbi Lezer ben Yaakov.
I understand this, because when we walk through the oil,
Yeah,
we're within 4 cubits.
that's why there's the wall. Remember, we talked about this yesterday. There's you have the.
What does that fence got to do with blocking the?
So we might, it might actually help. The next statement will actually help us understand that, because the fence turns the space you're in into a separate domain than the space of the corpse. So as we'll see in a moment, the corpse only takes up 4 cubits if it's out in the open and doesn't have any enclosure. If it's in an enclosure, then the impurity only stays within the enclosure, because there's a demarcation that says, this is my private domain and this is the corpse's domain and I'm staying away. So when there's that demarcation, right, it's often the case, by the way, since you're a Kohen, it's often the case that Kohanic families have their families or loved ones buried at the edge of the cemetery, so that the Kohen can stand outside a foot and a half away and not contract impurity, because there's a wall between them and because they're in separate domains.
Place is just in the
Oh, so there you go. So but the law here is specifically if it's out in the open, where there is no enclosure. So if there's no enclosure, how much space does it take up? Says Rabbi Lezer ben Yaakov, it takes up 4 cubits rabbinically, even though biblically it only takes up the airspace directly above it. Okay. So now we in Babel, with this new information, we go through the text we have and compare what we know to what we're learning. Right? That's what we've done till now. Commenting on what Rabbi Lezer ben Yaakov meant, what he said, whether we agree with it, don't agree with it. Right? Yesterday we rejected one of the laws. Right? About the stepsisters, siblings.
Yeah.
So the Gemara says as follows, top of 44a. The Tana Tuna, and we here in Babylonia, who have a copy of the Mishnah, have found in our Mishnah a statement that doesn't explicitly state what Rabbi Lezer ben Yaakov said, but implies it. How's that? So, Chatzer HaKaver, this is the quote from the Mishnah that we are now introducing to demonstrate that our Mishnah doesn't explicitly state the law of Rabbi Lezer ben Yaakov that a corpse takes up 4 cubits, but it infers it. Namely, Chatzer HaKaver, a courtyard that's around a grave. So to explain, back in Mishnaic times, and it seems like this lasted way past the Talmudic era as well, in early Jewish history, burials took place in caves, just like Abraham did for his wife. Now, the way they would bury in caves is not below, but actually on the sides. kind of like a mausoleum, but it's in the ground, right? Because it's in a cave. So the Mishnah also describes how what the exact dimensions and what size and how big and whatnot. But they would have like a cave you'd go into with like shelves or like how do you describe it? Like dugouts, yeah, coves, size of the corpse. They would insert the corpse and close it up, and that would be burial. So you'd walk in, and on the wall there would be plaques of who's where. Yeah. So you have this cave, and then on the outside of the cave there would be like a little courtyard with an enclosure and fenced in. There's a kind of foyer room to the cave. Okay. So this foyer room, because it has an enclosure, it gets the status of a quote separate room than the actual cave, and therefore says this Mishnah, the courtyard of the cave, one who stands in it, Torah is pure. No reason to contract ritual impurity. I'm not in the same domain, and I'm not under the same roof. The cave has its roof, and I'm standing under the sky. Right? So I'm not in the same space. But it's an extension of the space. Because there's a wall protruding from the cave around me. So therefore, it says in the Mishnah text, the only way in which that courtyard retains a separate space, halachically, from the cave, is if the courtyard has 4 cubits. These are the words of Beis Shammai. So Beis Shammai is of the view that in order for the courtyard to maintain a status as being a separate designated space from the cave, it must have 4 cubits. But the house of Hillel says you don't need that much space. All you need is arba tvachim, 4 handbreadths. It's a much tinier space. 4 handbreadths is, like you're saying, it's like this. It's tiny. So a tiny little courtyard, according to Beis Hillel, you can be standing inside, but because it's surrounded by an enclosure, it's a separate domain from the cave. So I'm jumping ahead a little bit just to make the point, because the Gemara is going to analyze the text. But what the Gemara is trying to do really is, at this point, is to say, look, we follow Beis Hillel, obviously, right? Which means if you're in a little enclosure and it's 4 tvachim wide, because it's got its own walls, it's a separate space. And that would explain the pathway going to the oil, because there's an enclosure around it. Even though it's less than 4 cubits, it's a separate domain, right? Which therefore means if it was in an open space, Beis Hillel would agree with Beis Shammai that it has to take up 4 cubits. The only reason why the only reason why Beis Hillel is allowing the courtyard to be less than 4 cubits, to be considered a separate domain from the graves, is because it has an enclosure. If it's no enclosure, it's got to be 4 cubits. And this is what the Gemara means when it says that even though we don't have a statement directly from, like Rabbi Lezer ben Yaakov, that says that a corpse takes up 4 cubits, but it's inferred. How is it inferred? It's inferred by the fact that Beis Hillel requires or allows for 4 tvachim only if it has a wall around it. But no wall, it would take up 4 cubits, so it's inferred. Clear? Okay, so now let's get to the Gemara's analysis of that statement of Beis Hillel.
Still don't understand why Adam and Eve were very different.
I don't know.
The Garden of Eden and Hebron?
They were kicked out of the Garden of Eden, I forgot.
Hmm?
They were kicked out of the Garden of Eden. They were banished.
And they end up in
Probably not so far. Anyway, okay, let's focus on this so we don't get distracted.
it's very interesting to find out.
Yeah. Okay, B'medvar Mamurim. When is this all said? When is it true? This is further to that Mishnah text. When is it true that a 4 tvachim courtyard, according to Beis Hillel, is considered a separate domain from the cave, and therefore the one standing it does not become impure because he's under the sky and he's in a separate domain because of the fence? This is only true, says the Mishnah, if it's opening from above, in which you descend into it, and that's why it's considered separate. But if the entrance is from the side, if you're walking in, not walking down, then divrei hakol, everyone agrees, even Beis Hillel agrees, arba amis, it has to have 4 cubits to be a separate domain. So at this point, it would seem that the Gemara is understanding it to be as follows: that when the entrance is above, it's because it's above, it's considered separate, and therefore you can get away with it only being 4 tvachim. But if it's by the side, it seems like an extension. So to make it separate, you have to have 4 cubits. You have to have the much bigger space. But the Gemara argues, klap elaya, should not the distinction be the reverse? Adrab, on the contrary. Minat sad, if the entrance is from the side, midrid, I think it's to pronounce it, venofik, you can just walk out and exit. Because you don't have to like step on anything or worry about touching anything. You just walk out. But melamaila, if your entrance is above, it seems to be very difficult for a person to climb out of a small little tube that's 4 tvachim and not accidentally put his hands over some grave on the way out. So you wanted to make the distinction, says the Gemara, that if it's above, it's considered a separate domain, and that's why you can get away with it being so small. The Gemara counter argues, if you have to climb upward, then somewhere in your climbing, you're going to be putting your hands on something and touching a grave, or at least putting your hand above the airspace of the grave. If you're walking directly out, then big deal, you walk out without touching anything. So shouldn't the distinction be the reverse? And says the Gemara, indeed, Ella, rather reverse it. The Medvar Mamorim, when is it that we allowed you to have a courtyard that's 4 tvachim in size? It's so small, and yet it's considered a separate courtyard from the cave. Is shepischim and asad, when the entrance is out on the side. So you're walking directly out, it's 2 separate domains. You're not touching anything. Here's the grave, here's the courtyard. You don't have to get in and out. You don't need to touch anything. And therefore, even if it's so small, it's considered a separate domain because it's enclosed. But if your entrance is from above, and therefore when you're climbing in and out, there's a concern, even if you're just in the cave, even if you're just in the courtyard, not walking into the cave, but to get into that space, you have to climb up and down. So there's a concern that you might actually put your hand over a grave. Arba amas, you have to have at least 4 cubits. So that way there's full space for you to enter and exit without worry of touching anything. Okay, now Hani Mili, here's the main point that we mentioned earlier. Hani Mili, when is it true that there might be the possibility, according to Beis Hillel's view, to make a space of a courtyard 4 tvachim narrow, and that's considered a separate courtyard from the corpse? Is only chatzir kever. It's only when you have a courtyard in which there's an enclosure, and that way you can say this is one domain, this is another domain. The mestaima mechitzasa, because it's ended by the space becomes ended by the wall. In other words, the space of the grave doesn't extend out of the wall. The wall is there; it stops it, even though it's very close. Aval meis ba'alma, but a corpse in the open, toughest, it would extend 4 amas. So even though our Mishnah doesn't explicitly back up Rebbe Eliezer ben Yaakov's position, it implies it by the fact that the Beis Hillel gives a special dispensation for a walled enclosure to allow for such a small space, means that only when you have that enclosure can you get this dispensation, where a small courtyard is considered a separate space from the grave. But if you don't have that enclosure, then the grave takes up 4 amas, and that answers why you can stand right outside the grave, a 1.5 feet or a few inches away from a grave, and you're not considered impure because there's a wall that separates between you and it, and the wall ends the space that the grave would have taken up.
And you have to have clear sky above it.
Yes, that's correct. Which I mentioned yesterday. If you walk down the path to the aisle, you'll notice that there are trees that are growing like near the graves on the outside of the fence. And if you look up, you see they're overhanging one way, but not overhanging the other way. They cut it. They trim them to go flush with the walls. And when you're walking down the path, there's no tent hanging over you.
Covering.
That's right. If you had the tree going both ways, you would be in the same quote enclosure of the grave, and the person would contract a ritual impurity. Okay, God willing, tomorrow we're going to get back to the Mishnah, which discussed the various different exemptions for the combat unit. And the 3 that we were discussing is the one who bought a new home and didn't get to inaugurate it yet, that we discussed at length. The one who planted a vineyard and didn't get to inaugurate it yet, didn't get to reap the benefits yet, we discussed that at length. And the 3rd one, which is what we're going to begin to discuss tomorrow, is the one who's engaged and didn't yet marry her. Right? So unless he died in battle and someone else married his wife that he never got to live with yet. So he's exempt from combat unit. Right? So there too, as you remember, the Gemara points out the anomalies in the verse. the fact that there is an expansive definition, a specific definition, and we're going to go through all of that, God willing, tomorrow and the days that follow. Oh,
I'll be here tomorrow.
but we're expecting you on Zoom by when?
Probably, Friday morning.
Friday morning. Okay, so wish you safe travels and look forward to seeing you very soon.
We'll probably get there Thursday morning. But about 8 o'clock or so, we may have done with the car and
Okay.
check in and.
So we hope to see you soon, and we hope you'll send us some sun through the screen.
After, Passover.
After Pesach, are they really staying for Pesach there?
Basically.
Not coming back for Pesach?
No, it's too much for Karen. She's
I see.
cleaned the house and everything.